If we created a public bank that supported green technology and cooperatives, that would be a huge breakthrough in this country for economic democracy. I don't believe that the factors of production trump everything. But I do believe, and that's why I'm giving my 15 minutes to this topic, that those who control the terms, amounts, and direction of credit play a huge role in determining the kind of society that everybody else ends up living in. We're getting a dramatic demonstration of that today. Simon Johnson, until 2 years ago, was chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, an organization that has done immense harm in many places around the globe that Johnson is just beginning to confront. He argues, in any case, that the finance industry has effectively captured our government. During his early career at MIT, Johnson tried to be skeptical about this, but then he went to the IMF and he got a close look at the symbiotic relationships between the world's economic elites and its governments. In the U.S., it goes way beyond mere collusion, he says. In this country, the two career tracks of government and high finance are simply melded together. And that is problematic when the oligarchy screws up and the economy implodes. Johnson stresses that when the IMF enters the scene of a crash, the economic part is usually very straightforward. Nations in crisis are told to live within their means by increasing exports, cutting imports, and breaking up bankrupt enterprises and banks. Every country that is not the USA would get that prescription. But the USA controls the IMF. It has a powerful and well-connected oligarchy, and it pays its foreign debts in its own currency. So our recovery begins by paying off Wall Street. There are significant differences between the South Korean and Indonesian crashes of 1997 and the Malaysian crash of '98 and Japan's lost decade and the recurrent crashes in Russia and Argentina and our current meltdown. But they all have in common the most important thing: a financial oligarchy that rigged the game in its favor, built an empire on debt, overreached in good times, and brought the house down on everybody else. When the house collapses, elites do what they always do. They take care of their own. To get a different result, a nation has to take control of the problem and break the grip of the oligarchy. Otherwise, you muddle along in a lost decade of your own, which just further entrenches the oligarchy. Johnson's analysis is strong on that point. But his prescription is straight out of the IMF playbook. Find a bottom, clear out the clutter, get the fiscal and monetary houses in order, shake up crony capitalism. There's always going to be an economic oligarchy, he says, so the best thing we can do is just shake it up from time to time. To this end, he recommends new antitrust laws, though he can't say what they will look like. And he notes that we're probably going to try to cap executive compensation, though he says that won't work. It never does. In his new book, 13 Bankers, which he co-authored with Jim Kwok, Johnson makes a strong case for shrinking the big banks. If we take the existing system for granted, that prescription is about the best that we can do. Our oligarchy has immense political and economic power. Virtually all of us are influenced by commercial advertising and materialism. Our economy is based on ever-expanding consumption. And if the U.S. opts for muddling through, well, we can just print more money. That's the path we're on. But if we democratize economic power and the process of investment, expanding the cooperative sector, investing in full employment and green technology, strengthening social market sectors that serve the needs of communities, and creating public banks and new forms of socially owned enterprises, we get better choices. Economic democracy builds up institutions that don't belong wholly to the capitalist market or the state. It begins by expanding the sector of producer and consumer cooperatives and community land trusts and community finance corporations. But merely expanding the cooperative sector is not enough. Cooperatives usually prohibit non-working shareholders, so they attract less outside financing than banks. They're committed to keeping low-return firms in operation, so they tend to stay in business even if they can't afford to pay competitive wages. They're committed to particular communities, which of course is a virtue, so they're less mobile than corporate capital. They smack of anti-capitalist bias, so they have trouble getting financing from banks. They tend to maximize net income per worker rather than profits, so they tend to favor capital-intensive investments over job creation. In addition to cooperatives, we need something bolder and more visionary. Forms of social ownership that facilitate democratic capital formation, that have a greater capacity for scaling up, and are more entrepreneurial. Specifically, we need public banks and mutual funded holding companies. This approach can take a variety of forms, but the essential idea is to establish competing banks or holding companies in which ownership of productive capital is vested. The companies lend capital to enterprises at market rates of interest and otherwise control the process of investment. Equity shareholders, the state, and or other cooperatives end up owning the holding companies or the public banks. Mutual fund models contain a built-in system of wage restraints, and they facilitate new forms of capital formation. They require no program of nationalization, and investors still seek the highest rate of return. This approach does not rest on idealistic ideas about human nature. Economic democracy is a brake on human greed and domination. The whole point of it is to fight the propensity of dominant groups to hoard social goods and to abuse disenfranchised people. Neither is there a blueprint for it. I've got favorite theories and models to push, but the key thing is to expand the social market in different ways and find out which models work in particular circumstances. I have spent much of my career contending, urging, and imploring that there is such a thing as progressive religion. Along the way, many of my friends have given up. But I come to conferences like this one mostly to see the friends that haven't given up and to make new friends in the struggle. I know all the arguments against hanging in there with organizations like the National Council of Churches, the Industrial Areas Foundation, the Gamaliel Network, the NAACP, Code Pink, the Network of Spiritual Progressives. We're too small and divided. Nobody's watching. Nothing will make a difference. But I believe that these organizations are beacons of hope in a terrible time and vehicles of whatever progressive social change is possible. Recently, I was on a team that wrote a new social creed for the National Council of Churches. There are 35 denominations in the National Council, and it goes without saying that they don't agree about doctrine. That's why you have a National Council. But some of us still believe that these denominations should be able to agree about social justice and do something about it. And so we have a social creed for the 21st century. It calls for full civil, political, and economic rights for women and men of all races. It demands the abolition of forced labor, human trafficking, and the exploitation of children. It supports employment for all at a family-sustaining living wage with equal pay for comparable work. It stands up for the right of workers to organize. It opposes the death penalty, calls for the abatement of hunger and poverty, and endorses universal health care, the real thing, Social Security, and progressive tax policies. It commends immigration policies that protect family unity and foster international cooperation. It stresses the necessity of adopting simpler lifestyles, living within our means, protecting the Earth's environment, and investing in renewable energy. It supports equitable global trade that protects local economies and advocates a foreign policy based on international law and multilateral diplomacy. It calls for nuclear disarmament, reductions in military spending, and the abolition of torture. and it calls for cooperation and dialogue among the world's religions. It is not an easy thing to get a statement like this through a body as conflicted, diverse, and cautious as the National Council of Churches. Every line of this new social creed has a story behind it and a series of battles, and a few lines are taken straight from the original social creed of 1908. We are living in a terrible time, and there is deep disappointment over President Obama's performance as president. But for 30 years, you had to be a stubborn type even to talk about the issues that we are addressing at this conference. Today, we are in a crisis that must not be wasted. If the stubborn types can seize this terrible moment as an opportunity to build a better social order, we might actually do it.